Hello, it's Hammy time, and in this video I show you how I made my faux plants for my hamster's enclosures. They're made from hamster-safe materials. I made them because I wanted a lot of green plants that were safe for hamsters to chew on. I don't want to use real plants that are safe for hamsters because it would honestly bother me too much to see them get destroyed, and it would get too expensive to keep replacing them. I've made faux plants in the past using children's craft paper, but unfortunately the craft paper faded over time and they're not as durable as my new ones. I wanted a woodland theme, so I used the wild plants in the woods behind my house for inspiration. I used various hamster-safe natural materials and dyed them with food coloring. I tried to use vegetable food coloring, but it just didn't work for this project. I used 3 different commercial brands and I even made my own from vegetables, but the color didn't take well and they just looked too dull and muddy. The Wilson brand had the perfect green color that looked the most natural to me, so after a lot of experimentation, that's what I ended up using. The materials I used to make the grass and leaves are corn husks used to make tamales. I got them from the grocery store. They're sold in packages and they're really cheap. To make the leaves for the vines, I cut the corn husks into strips and rounded off the ends. I put some of the food coloring into a pot of water and turned on the heat. I added the leaves and brought the water to a boil. The corn husk takes a while to absorb the color. The first time I tried to dye the corn husk, I didn't think it was working because it didn't seem to be absorbing the color, but when the water had boiled down to almost nothing, the corn husk suddenly started to absorb the color as it cooled down. I don't know the scientific explanation for it. All I can say is the color starts to absorb when most of the water is gone. I definitely watch it and turn off the heat when that happens so I don't burn the pot. I let the leaves sit in the pot for about half an hour and then I took them out and put them on cooling racks and let them dry out. The corn husk curls up when it dries, so I used an iron to flatten them out. I actually really like this part because it's so satisfying to see it flatten out. The material I used for the vine is from a grapevine wreath I got from a thrift store. I boiled it in water to sanitize it. To attach the leaves, I used brown raffia ribbon to tie them onto the grapevine. To make it easier to tie them on, I dipped the center of the leaves in a bowl of water to make them malleable. I wrapped the leaves multiple times to get them to sit straight on the vine, and then I tied them off and cut off the excess ribbon. I kept adding leaves until I was happy with the length. I trimmed the vine to the length I wanted, leaving extra vine at the bottom so it can be inserted down into the bedding to anchor it. To keep the leaves from sliding out of place, I added a little school glue to secure them. And here's how they turned out. I made some smaller ones with smaller leaves as well. To make the grass, I dyed some natural raffia green to use to tie the grass together. For the blades of grass, I cut the corn husk into strips. I used the same process of letting the water boil down and then let it sit after turning off the heat. I took it out and put it on a cooling rack to dry. After they dried, I just used my fingernails to straighten them because they were too skinny to iron. I used pieces of straw to tie the grass to, but later I switched them out for pieces of bamboo skewers because the straw breaks too easily. I put the grass in a bunch, put some school glue on the straw, and then wrapped and tied them up with a raffia ribbon. I secured the ribbon with a bit of glue, clipped it with a clothespin, and let it dry. Here's how they turned out. I also made some wider ones. To make a layered leaf plant, I used an applewood stick, some raffia ribbon, and some corn husk leaves. I glued on the leaves with school glue in layers and wrapped them with raffia ribbon as I went along. I continued to wrap the stick and then used some glue to secure it at the end. I clipped it and let it dry. I also made some without wrapping it in raffia. I just glued the leaves on in layers and used clips to hold them in place while it dried. And here's how they turned out. I made some using the grass as well. I made a small tree using a sanitized applewood branch from an apple tree in my yard. I sanitized it by boiling it in water. For the tree, I put a dot of non-toxic hot glue on the leaves to glue them on and clip them with clothespins to let them dry in place. It could be done with school glue instead, but it would need more glue and it would take much longer to dry. And here's how it turned out. This next one is my favorite. I made a little tree from chewed up millet sprays. I've been collecting my hamster's chewed up millet sprays for some time because I knew I could make something from them. I dyed these using the same process as the corn husk. I used a piece of willow for the stem. I glued on the millet with a little hot glue to make the branches. And here's how it turned out. I love this one because it reminds me of antique goose feather Christmas trees. I'm gonna make some for Christmas decorations. I made another little tree using sphagnum moss. Sphagnum moss has long pieces that can be separated out, so I thought they would look like branches. I dyed the moss and let it dry out. I like how the different materials have different shades of green from the same dye. I think it makes it look more natural. I glued and clipped pieces of the moss in layers onto a piece of willow. And here's how it turned out. The last ones I made are the purple flowers. I used violet food coloring to dye the corn husk for the flowers. I used paper pop sticks for the stems. I used pop sticks because I can bend them into shape. I found these in the baking supplies. I used my green corn husk grass for the leaves. I dyed the corn husk in pop sticks. I let them dry and then I ironed out the purple pieces. To make the flower petals, I cut one side of a piece of purple corn husk to make a fringed edge. I put some school glue on the corn husk and wrapped it around the stick. I picked at the petals to keep them from sticking together as it dried. I glued on the leaves. I tied it off with some raffia ribbon. I made 4 of them to bunch together, and here's how they turned out. I made some daisy flowers as well, but I used white paper to make the petals. I didn't think I could dye the corn husk white, so I didn't bother to try. You can see how I made the daisies in my paper flowers video. That's how I made my faux green plants. I really like how they look. The color doesn't fade and they're really cheap to make, so I made extra batches of everything so I can make more when I need to. Thank you for watching.